A CEO's car spun off a frozen mountain road in the middle of a blizzard, and the only person close enough to save her was a mechanic who could barely afford to fix his own truck. Neither of them knew that night would decide the fate of an entire town, or that one man's kindness would put a target on his back. By the time the snow finally stopped falling, everything about their lives would be different, and not everyone was happy about it. Before we get into it, if stories like this one pull at your heart, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another from Winter Vale. Stay with us until the very end, because this story has a turn in it that most people never see coming. Winter has always felt like a season of quiet honesty to me, the kind of cold that strips away everything false and leaves only what actually matters underneath. This story grew out of that thought, out of the idea that one snowy night can reveal a person's true character faster than a lifetime of easy summers ever could. I hope Wesley and Natalie's road through the storm means as much to you as it did to me while I was writing it. Wesley Carter had grease under his fingernails that never fully washed out anymore, no matter how hard he scrubbed. At 26, he ran the day-to-day work at Higgins Auto, the only repair shop in Cedar Hollow, Colorado, a town of just under 4,000 people tucked against the base of Frost Peak Mountain. He had taken on double shifts for the past 6 months, ever since his grandfather's heart had started giving him trouble, and the extra hours barely covered the medication that kept the old man walking around at all. Earl Carter had raised Wesley alone after Wesley's parents died in a highway accident when he was 9, and Wesley had never once thought of that as a burden. Earl taught him how to rebuild an engine before he taught him how to shave, and the two of them had lived in the same small house on Larkspur Street for as long as Wesley could remember. Lately, though, Earl's hands shook too much to hold a wrench, and Wesley found himself doing the cooking, the cleaning, and the worrying that used to belong to his grandfather. Earl had been a machinist himself once, 30 years at a plant 2 towns over before his hands finally gave out, and he still talked about torque specs and gear ratios the way other old men talked about baseball. He never once complained about the money, not out loud, though Wesley sometimes caught him rearranging his pill bottles at night, counting them like he was trying to make them stretch further than the label allowed. Wesley never mentioned that he had noticed, because Earl had spent his whole life being the one who took care of things, and Wesley refused to be the reason that ever changed. Ray Higgins, who owned the shop and had known Wesley since he was a kid sneaking around the garage bay, trusted him with almost everything now. That week, the local news had been running warnings about an incoming storm system expected to dump 2 feet of snow across the county, with ice underneath it heavy enough to snap power lines. Most of the tourists who came for the ski season had already cleared out of town, but the locals knew this kind of weather, and they knew better than to take it lightly. On the afternoon the storm was supposed to hit, Wesley stayed late at the shop finishing a brake job on old Mrs. Alvarez's sedan because she needed the car reliable before the roads turned to ice. He watched the sky through the bay door as it dropped from pale gray to something closer to slate, and by the time he locked up and climbed into his truck, the first real flakes were already falling sideways in the wind. He told himself he would be home in 15 minutes, plenty of time before the roads got bad. 40 miles away, in a glass office tower in Denver, Natalie Brooks was staring at a spreadsheet she already knew by heart. She was 29 years old and had been running Meridian Dynamics for just under 2 years, ever since her father Charles Brooks had passed away from a stroke that nobody saw coming. The company he built from a single machine shop into a mid-sized manufacturing firm now employed almost 1,100 people, and the plant in Ironwood Falls, the smallest and oldest of their facilities, was bleeding money every quarter. Her chief financial officer, Bradley Simmons, wanted the Ironwood Falls plant closed by the end of the fiscal year and its remaining contracts sold off to a competitor called the Halloway Group. Bradley had worked under her father for 15 years and had expected, first privately and then almost openly, to be named CEO himself when Charles Brooks died. Instead, the board had chosen Natalie, and Bradley had spent 2 years smiling through gritted teeth while he waited for her to make a mistake he could point to. Natalie did not trust the numbers on their own. She had grown up walking the floor of that plant with her father, learning the names of machinists before she learned half her college coursework, and she refused to shut it down based only on a report written by people who had never set foot inside it. Against Bradley's strong objection, she decided to drive out to Ironwood Falls herself the next morning to walk the floor, talk to the foreman, and see with her own eyes whether the plant could be saved. Renee Ford, her chief of staff, begged her to postpone the trip because of the storm warning, but Natalie had already delayed the visit twice, and the workers deserved better than another cancellation from someone they had started to see as a stranger in a corner office. She left before dawn the next morning in her own car instead of a company vehicle, wearing jeans and an old wool coat instead of a suit, because she wanted the workers to see her as her father's daughter and not as a headline. She did not tell anyone which route she planned to take. The road up through Frost Peak Pass was the fastest way to Ironwood Falls, but it was also the most dangerous, a narrow two-lane stretch that hugged the mountainside with nothing but a low guardrail between the pavement and a long drop. Natalie had driven it a dozen times before and knew every curve, or thought she did, right up until the moment her tires lost their grip on a sheet of black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. The car fishtailed once, twice, and then spun completely before slamming sideways into an old pine tree at the edge of the road. Wesley was less than a quarter-mile behind her, driving slower than usual because visibility had dropped to almost nothing. He saw her headlights swing wildly through the snowfall and then vanish, and his stomach dropped before his mind had even finished processing what he had just watched happen. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder as fast as he safely could and grabbed the flashlight he kept under the seat, running toward the wreck with the wind cutting straight through his jacket. The driver's side of Natalie's car was crushed against the tree, the door bent inward so badly that it would not budge no matter how hard Wesley pulled at the handle. Through the spiderwebbed windshield, he could see her slumped against the seatbelt, blood running from a cut above her eyebrow and disappearing into her hairline, her eyes closed and her face pale against the dark upholstery. He forced himself to breathe slowly and think like a mechanic instead of a panicking stranger, because panic was not going to get that door open. He circled around to the passenger side, and though that door was jammed too, the back door gave way when he threw his shoulder into it. Reaching across the seat, he found the mechanism to recline the driver's seat and carefully lowered it, easing her weight backward while keeping one hand braced under her neck the way he had once seen on a first aid poster in the shop's break room. Snow blew in through the open door and settled on her coat as he worked, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered how strange it was that something so beautiful could look so fragile. It took him almost 10 minutes of careful, deliberate movements to get her free of the seatbelt and out of the wreck without twisting her neck or spine, and by the time he had her settled across the back seat of his truck, his hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline in equal measure. He reached for his phone to call for help and found the screen dark, the battery dead from a full day of use at the shop with the charger cable he had meant to replace for weeks. There was no time to waste cursing his own bad luck, so he simply started the truck and pointed it towards Cedar Hollow General. The drive down the mountain felt longer than any drive of his life, his headlights barely cutting through the snow, his eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror to check that she was still breathing. He talked to her the whole way, not because he expected an answer, but because the silence in the truck felt unbearable otherwise, telling her that she was going to be fine, that they were almost there, that whoever was waiting for her would be so relieved to see her. When the hospital's lit sign finally appeared through the storm, his shoulders dropped an inch, the first easing of tension he had allowed himself since the crash. He half carried her through the emergency room doors, shouting for help before the doors had even finished sliding open, and the staff moved fast the moment they saw the blood on her face and the way her head lolled against his arm. A team of nurses lifted her onto a gurney and wheeled her back through a set of double doors, and a nurse with kind eyes told Wesley to wait in the corridor while the doctors examined her. He sat down hard on a plastic chair, his knees suddenly unsteady now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. He borrowed a phone charger from the front desk and plugged in his own dead phone, mostly out of habit, though he had no one urgent to call except Earl, who would worry if Wesley did not come home soon. Before he could dial, every light in the hospital flickered once and then died, plunging the corridor into total darkness broken only by the emergency exit signs glowing faintly overhead. A chorus of startled voices rose up from every direction as staff scrambled to check on patients using the flashlights on their phones. A security guard named Hank Dolan hurried past, and Wesley grabbed his arm. "What happened?" he asked. "Storm knocked out power to half the county," Hank said, breathing hard, "and the backup generator won't kick in." Every machine keeping people alive in this building is running on battery, and those batteries don't last more than an hour. Wesley thought immediately of Natalie somewhere behind those doors, hooked up to monitors that might already be counting down. "Take me to the generator room," he said. "Right now." The old diesel generator sat in a cramped concrete room in the basement, and one look told Wesley that its control panel had been fried, probably by a power surge when the grid first started failing. He had spent years fixing engines that other people had already given up on, and this one did not look any worse than half the trucks that came through Higgins Auto on a bad week. He asked Hank to hold the flashlight steady and got to work, tracing wires with fingers still stiff from the cold outside. It took him nearly 40 minutes, working by flashlight with tools he had to borrow piece by piece from the hospital's maintenance closet, but he finally isolated a burnt relay and rigged a bypass using a spare part Hank found in a supply bin. When he flipped the switch and the generator coughed once before roaring to life, the lights overhead flickered back on throughout the entire building, and a cheer went up somewhere on the floor above them. Hank clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him, calling him some kind of miracle worker. Wesley made his way back to the emergency room waiting area just as a doctor stepped out through the double doors, and he stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. "She's got a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a cut that needed stitches," the doctor said, introducing herself as Dr. Naomi Blackwood, "but she's stable, and I expect a full recovery." She paused before adding, "If you'd waited even 20 more minutes to bring her in, the internal bleeding we found might not have been treatable." Relief hit Wesley harder than he expected, loosening something behind his ribs that he had not realized was clenched so tight. He thought briefly of how close the whole night had come to going differently, of the dead phone in his pocket and the jammed door and the 10 unbearable minutes it had taken to free her. "Do you know her?" Dr. Blackwood asked. Wesley shook his head. "No, ma'am. I just saw her car go off the road. Did what anybody would have done." The doctor gave him a long look, the kind that suggested not everyone would have done what he did. "You're welcome to wait if you want," she said. "Could be hours before she's awake, though." Exhaustion finally caught up with Wesley somewhere around midnight, and he decided there was nothing more he could do sitting in a hospital chair while Earl waited alone at home worrying about the storm. He left his name and number with the front desk in case anyone needed to reach him, then drove home through streets buried under nearly a foot of fresh snow, the plows still hours from clearing Larkspur Street. Earl was waiting up when he walked in, and Wesley told him the whole story over cold soup at the kitchen table, still too wound up to feel how tired he actually was. Natalie woke up the next morning to fluorescent light and the steady beep of a heart monitor, her head throbbing and her ribs aching with every breath. Renee Ford was already there, having driven through the tail end of the storm the moment she got word from the highway patrol about the crash, and she gripped Natalie's hand so tightly it almost hurt. Renee explained, piecing it together from what the nurses had told her, that a local mechanic had pulled Natalie from the wreck, driven her here himself, and then fixed the hospital's generator when the power failed during the worst of the storm. Natalie asked, her voice raw and unfamiliar to her own ears, whether the man was still there, and Renee had to admit she did not know since the front desk only had a name and a phone number written on a torn piece of paper. Something about the story stuck with Natalie all through the rest of that day, through the visits from Dr. Blackwood and the careful instructions about rest and follow-up appointments. A stranger had risked the roads in a blizzard for her, then spent 40 minutes in a freezing basement fixing a machine that had nothing to do with him, and she felt an urgent need to thank him properly. 3 days later, once the doctors cleared her to travel, Natalie asked Renee to drive her to Cedar Hollow instead of straight back to Denver. She found Wesley's name and address easily enough from the hospital records, and when Renee pulled up outside a small house on Larkspur Street with a single truck in the driveway, Natalie felt strangely nervous in a way that boardrooms full of investors had never managed to make her feel. She knocked on the door herself, refusing Renee's offer to do it for her, and waited with her breath fogging in the cold. Wesley opened the door in an old flannel shirt with a wrench still in his hand from working on something in the garage, and for a moment he simply stared, not recognizing the woman standing on his porch as the same person he had pulled from a wrecked car days earlier. "My name's Natalie Brooks," she said, "and I've spent 3 days trying to figure out how a person even starts to thank someone for saving her life." Wesley, embarrassed by the attention, shrugged and said, Anybody around here would have done the same for a stranger stuck in that snow. Wasn't anything special. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the tired lines around his eyes that seemed too deep for someone his age, and something about his easy humility made her want to know more rather than less. Natalie explained, carefully at first and then more directly, that she ran Meridian Dynamics, the company that owned the struggling plant in nearby Ironwood Falls, and that she had been on her way there the morning of the crash to try to save the jobs of nearly 200 people. Wesley's expression shifted at that, because half the families he had grown up around worked shifts at that very plant. Natalie asked if she could come inside for a few minutes, and Wesley, caught off guard, led her into the small living room where Earl sat in his recliner watching the local news. Earl greeted her warmly despite having no idea who she was, offering her the good chair the way he offered it to every guest. And Natalie found herself unexpectedly charmed by the easy warmth of a household that clearly did not have much money, but seemed to have plenty of everything that actually mattered. She stayed almost an hour longer than she had planned, listening to Earl's stories about the town and Wesley's quiet corrections whenever his grandfather stretched the truth for effect. Before she left, Natalie pulled a check from her bag, an amount large enough to cover Earl's medical bills several times over, and held it out to him. "I can't take that," Wesley said, shaking his head firmly. "I didn't pull you out of that car hoping to get paid for it." She respected the refusal more than she expected to, but she was not the kind of person who gave up easily. "Fine," she said, tucking the check back into her bag. "No money, but you can do me one favor instead. Come with me to Ironwood Falls next week and talk to the workers there. They might actually listen to somebody who sounds like them, since God knows they don't listen to me." Before he agreed, Wesley asked her one question that seemed to catch her off guard. "Do you actually care about those people?" he said. "Or is this just about a number on a balance sheet?" Natalie did not answer right away, and when she finally did, her voice had lost its practiced boardroom smoothness entirely. "My father used to take me to that plant every summer when I was a kid," she said. "I still remember the names of the men who taught me to weld before I was tall enough to reach the table." Wesley agreed, mostly because he could not think of a graceful way to say no to someone who had already proven she did not give up when she believed in something. The following Tuesday, he rode with Natalie and Renee out to the plant, standing beside her on the factory floor while she walked the line and asked questions of every foreman and machinist who would talk to her. "Is it true you're shutting us down?" One older worker named Sal Marino asked bluntly, arms crossed, before Natalie could even answer. Wesley spoke up first. "I've met her," he said. "Trust me, she's fighting harder for this place than anybody realizes." Sal studied him for a second, then nodded slowly, like the words meant more coming from a mechanic than they ever would have from a suit. That single moment did something neither of them expected. The workers, who had spent months distrusting every word out of corporate headquarters, seemed to soften slightly hearing it from a local mechanic instead of a suit from Denver, and Natalie noticed the shift immediately. Over the following weeks, she found reasons to bring Wesley along to more meetings, and he found himself driving to Denver more often than made sense for a man who was supposed to be running a repair shop full-time. Ray Higgins, noticing the pattern, teased him mercilessly about it every time he came back late. What started as gratitude slowly became something neither of them had planned for. Natalie found herself calling Wesley in the evenings just to talk through her day, and Wesley found himself looking forward to those calls more than he wanted to admit, even to Earl. One evening in early December, after another long day at the plant, Wesley walked Natalie to her car through a light snowfall, and neither of them moved to say goodbye for several minutes, standing close enough that their breath mixed together in the cold air between them. "I didn't expect any of this when I got in my car that morning," Natalie said, her breath fogging in the cold. "I built walls around myself after my father died, because everyone around me seemed to want something from the company and not from me." Wesley admitted he had built his own walls too. "Stopped expecting anything good to happen to people like me and Earl a long time ago," he said. Neither of them kissed the other that night, but something settled between them anyway, an understanding that this was becoming real whether either of them had planned for it or not. A week later, Natalie showed up at Larkspur Street on a Sunday with takeout containers balanced in both arms, insisting she wanted one evening that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or plan inspections or anything with the word Meridian attached to it. Earl teased her mercilessly about her inability to properly season a pot of chili, and Natalie laughed harder that night than Wesley had heard from her in the entire time he had known her, the sound of it filling the small kitchen in a way that made the house feel less empty than it had in years. Driving her home much later, through streets already dusted with the season's first light snow, Wesley thought that he had never once seen her look more like herself than she did sitting at his grandfather's chipped kitchen table. Bradley Simmons noticed the change in Natalie before most people did, because he made it his business to notice everything happening at Meridian Dynamics that might affect his own position. He had spent 2 years waiting for an opportunity to undermine her authority with the board, and the sight of the CO, growing personally attached to a small-town mechanic, looked, to him, like exactly the kind of weakness he could exploit. Bradley had his own reasons for wanting the Ironwood Falls plant closed fast and without much scrutiny, reasons that had nothing to do with the company's balance sheet. For over a year, Bradley had been secretly funneling money into high-stakes card games in Denver and Las Vegas, chasing losses that had grown far larger than his salary could cover no matter how carefully he hid the withdrawals. A private buyer connected to the Halloway Group had approached him off the record, offering a substantial personal payout if he could push through the sale of the Ironwood Falls assets before the fiscal year closed, a deal structured in a way that would never appear on any public filing. Bradley told himself he deserved it after 15 years of loyalty to a company that had passed him over for the top job in favor of a woman half his age with half his experience. He began collecting evidence, hiring a private investigator on the side to photograph Natalie and Wesley together, building a narrative he could present to the board as proof that the CEO's judgment had become compromised by a personal relationship with an outside party who had no business influencing corporate decisions. He also dug into Wesley's background, hoping to find something he could use, and eventually found an old safety citation from years earlier at Higgins Auto that Ray had already resolved and paid off in full. Bradley decided the truth mattered less than how the story could be told. Not satisfied with the photographs alone, he arranged, through a contact who owed him a favor, for an anonymous safety complaint to be filed against Higgins Auto with the state licensing board, hoping that a formal investigation into Wesley's own shop would make him look reckless and unreliable enough that the board would dismiss him as an outside influence entirely. Ray Higgins received the notice on a Thursday morning and called Wesley in a panic. "State's opening a full investigation into the shop," Ray said, his voice tight. "I've never had a single real complaint in 22 years, Wes, and now all of a sudden this shows up out of nowhere." Wesley promised him they had done nothing wrong and that they would get to the bottom of it, though privately he already suspected exactly whose name belonged behind it. At the next scheduled board meeting, Bradley requested time on the agenda and slid a folder of photographs across the table before Natalie had even finished her opening remarks. "I think it's time we discussed why the CEO overruled her own CFO's recommendation on Ironwood Falls," he said, sliding the folder toward Vera Lindholm and the other board members. These were taken over the past 6 weeks. Natalie's stomach dropped as the photographs made their way around the table, images of her and Wesley outside his house, at the plant, walking to her car in the snow. "This is a matter of fiduciary responsibility," Bradley continued, his tone level and rehearsed, "not personal jealousy, whatever anyone wants to call it. The CEO's judgment on a 9-figure asset appears to be compromised by a personal relationship with an outside party who stands to benefit from her continued visits to that town. His name is Wesley Carter," Natalie said, her voice tight but controlled. "He saved my life, Bradley, and you know that better than anyone since you were the one who dug up his address to build this folder in the first place." Bradley did not blink. "That doesn't change the optics," he said, "or the fact that this board has a duty to ask hard questions when a major asset decision and a personal entanglement happen to line up." Several board members who barely knew Natalie exchanged uneasy glances at the accusation, and when the vote was called, it went narrowly against her, suspending her authority over the Ironwood Falls decision pending an independent review. Natalie left that meeting shaken in a way she rarely allowed herself to be in public, walking straight past Renee's questions and shutting her office door before finally letting her composure crack. She called Wesley that night and told him everything, her voice tight with anger and something closer to shame. worried that her feelings for him had somehow become the reason 200 families might lose their jobs. Wesley listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her plainly that he refused to believe caring about someone honestly could ever be the thing that ruined her, and that they would figure out how to prove it together. Vera Lindholm, the most senior member of the board, and someone who had known Natalie since she was a child following her father through the Ironwood Falls plant, requested a private meeting with Natalie the following day. Bradley's numbers on the plant's projected losses never quite added up to me, Vera said, setting a stack of quarterly reports on the table between them. Not in 15 years of me reviewing his work. And this sudden urgency to close the deal before year-end feels rehearsed, not reasoned. Somebody wants this sale to happen fast, and I don't think it's the board. She tapped the folder. Find out who benefits from a quick sale to Holloway, Natalie. Then we'll know what we're actually dealing with. Renee spent the next 2 nights at the office with a forensic accountant Vera recommended, spreading printouts across a conference table until well past midnight. Look at this, Renee said, sliding a highlighted page toward Natalie on the second night, her eyes red from exhaustion. An offshore account, opened 14 months ago, receiving transfers that line up almost exactly with 3 casino losses we can trace back to Bradley's known travel dates. Natalie stared at the numbers in silence for a long moment. He's not protecting the company, she said finally. He's paying off a debt with it. That same week, Sal Marino pulled Wesley aside on the plant floor during a break. Funny thing, Sal said, wiping grease from his hands. Fella in a gray suit came through here a few weeks back, asking real specific questions about equipment valuations. Didn't sound like the usual corporate stuff. Sounded like he already knew what he wanted the answer to be. Wesley described Bradley from the gala photos Natalie had shown him, and Sal nodded slowly. That's him, he said. That's the fella. Wesley called Natalie that same night with the detail, and it became another thread in the pattern closing in around Bradley. At an emergency board session called specifically to review the evidence, Natalie presented the restructuring plan she had spent weeks developing with the Ironwood Falls foreman, mostly after hours and without Bradley's knowledge, showing that the plant could return to profitability within 18 months through targeted investment rather than closure. It seemed, for a moment, like enough. Several board members who had voted against her the previous month now looked convinced, and Bradley's face had gone noticeably pale as the numbers were laid out point by point in front of everyone. The apparent victory did not last. 2 days later, Bradley made his final and most desperate move, finalizing behind closed doors a private agreement to sell his own substantial personal shares directly to a shell company controlled by the Holloway Group, a maneuver designed to trigger a hostile takeover clause buried deep in Meridian's corporate bylaws that neither Natalie nor Renee had thought to check closely enough. If the sale completed, Holloway would gain enough combined voting power to force an emergency shareholder vote and push through the plant closure regardless of what the rest of the board decided. The company's annual winter gala, a tradition Charles Brooks had started decades earlier to thank employees and investors alike, was scheduled for that same week, and Bradley planned to announce the completed sale publicly there, framing it as a fait accompli the board would have no choice but to accept. Natalie learned of the plan only hours beforehand, when Vera Lindholm, tipped off by a nervous compliance officer, called her in a near panic. Snow was already falling heavily outside the Grand Hotel ballroom where the gala would be held, the wide windows framing a courtyard slowly disappearing under white as guests arrived in their evening clothes. Wesley arrived at the gala in a borrowed suit that fit him awkwardly across the shoulders, standing beside Natalie as she moved through the crowd with a composure that hid how close she felt to breaking. Bradley found them near the center of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in his hand and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I think everyone here deserves to know," he announced, raising his voice just enough for the surrounding guests to turn and listen, "that the Holloway Group now holds a controlling interest sufficient to force the closure of Ironwood Falls, regardless of anyone's personal feelings on the matter." Natalie stepped forward before the murmurs in the room could grow any louder. "I know exactly what you did, Bradley," she said, her voice calm and carrying easily across the sudden hush. "Renee and a forensic accountant have already traced the offshore transfers tied to your gambling debts, and the payout Holloway promised you for pushing this sale through." Bradley's composed expression cracked at last. "You have no proof of anything," he snapped, his jaw tightening. You're just trying to save face in front of the people whose trust you've already lost." The ballroom had gone almost completely silent by then. Every guest turned toward the unfolding scene. Vera Lindholm stepped forward next, holding a folder Renee had prepared that afternoon. "The transfers began 14 months ago," she read aloud, "in amounts that line up almost exactly with your losses at 3 separate casinos." She set a phone down on the table beside her and pressed play, and Bradley's own voice filled the room, recorded weeks earlier by Sal Marino's phone in an empty hallway at the plant, talking carelessly about the deal already being arranged with Holloway. Bradley's face went from red to ashen as the room's attention turned fully against him, and several board members who had supported him only days earlier now stepped visibly away, as if his desperation might somehow be contagious. "This doesn't change the fact that the plant is losing money," Bradley said, trying one last angle. "Closing it is still the responsible choice, no matter who benefits from the timing." Natalie held up the restructuring plan the board had already reviewed days earlier. "It projects profitability within 18 months, she said, "a projection you never once challenged with real numbers, Bradley, only with urgency. Urgency that makes a lot more sense now that everyone in this room knows what was actually funding it." Bradley's voice finally cracked when he spoke again, no longer smooth or composed. 15 years, he said. 15 years of loyalty, and I watched Charles's daughter inherit everything I spent my whole career building toward. The debts got too heavy to climb out from under honestly. So yes, I took the money. Are you happy now?" It was, in its own way, the most human thing anyone in that room had ever heard him say, and even Natalie felt an unexpected flicker of pity beneath her anger. Security escorted him out minutes later while the board convened on the spot to void his shares and unwind the fraudulent sale before it could ever take legal effect. The state licensing board dropped its investigation into Higgins Auto within days once Renee flagged the complaint as part of the same pattern of retaliation, and Ray Higgins called Wesley just to say, gruffly and without much sentiment, that he had never doubted the shop for a single minute. By the time the gala ended, word had already spread that the Ironwood Falls plant would remain open under Natalie's restructuring plan, funded in part by the very shares Bradley had tried to use against her, now redistributed among the remaining board members loyal to the original vision Charles Brooks had built the company on. Sal Marino called Wesley late that night, his voice thick with relief, to say that the entire plant floor had heard the news and that people were already talking about throwing a celebration once the roads cleared enough for everyone to gather. In the days that followed, Wesley found himself pulling back without quite meaning to, unsure whether what had happened between him and Natalie could survive outside the pressure of a crisis that had thrown them together so completely. He told himself she belonged to a world of boardrooms and galas that he had only ever visited as a guest wearing a borrowed suit, and that once the excitement faded, she would realize how little they actually had in common. He stopped calling as often, telling himself it was for her own good, even as it left a hollow feeling in his chest every evening. Natalie noticed the distance immediately and refused to accept it without a fight. On a Saturday 2 weeks after the gala, with the season's first heavy snowfall blanketing Cedar Hollow in white, she drove out to Larkspur Street herself instead of calling, and found Wesley in the garage working on a car that did not particularly need fixing. "I left you 3 voicemails this week," she said, arms crossed against the cold. "I didn't fight off a hostile takeover in a boardroom full of men twice my age just to lose my nerve now over a man too stubborn to answer his phone." She looked at him directly, without any of the careful diplomacy she used in board meetings. "Are you pulling away because you don't want this anymore, or because you're scared it won't last?" Wesley set down his wrench. "I'm scared I'm the reason people are whispering about your judgment again," he admitted. "I've got a roof that leaks and a grandfather living on a fixed income, and you've got boardrooms and companies with my name never supposed to show up anywhere near them." Natalie crossed the garage toward him. "I've spent my whole life around people who wanted something from my name or my money," she said. "You're the first person who ever wanted nothing from me except my company. That was true the night you pulled me out of that car, and it's still true right now. I don't care what anyone whispers," she went on. Bradley's whole downfall already proved exactly what kind of judgment actually deserves to be trusted around here. "I'm not walking away from the one thing in the last 2 years that's felt completely real." Wesley crossed the small distance between them and kissed her there in the garage, snow still falling outside the open bay door, and neither of them pulled back this time to second-guess what it meant. The following spring, once the plant's restructuring plan had proven itself in the first quarter's numbers, Natalie made Higgins Auto the official maintenance contractor for Meridian Dynamics' entire regional fleet, a contract that let Ray finally hire 2 more mechanics and let Wesley cut back his hours enough to actually rest. Earl's health improved steadily once the extra income made better care possible, and he took to introducing Natalie to every neighbor on Larkspur Street as though she were already family, which by then, in every way that mattered, she was. The following December, on the 1-year anniversary of the night she crashed on Frost Peak Pass, Natalie asked Wesley to drive her up that same road, insisting she needed to see it again without fear controlling the decision. They stopped at the spot where the old pine tree still bore a faint scar in its bark, snow falling softly around them the way it had that first terrible night, and Wesley pulled a small box from his coat pocket that he had been carrying for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment. "A year ago I pulled you out of a wrecked car right here and had no idea who you were," he said, his voice unsteady. "I'd like to spend the rest of my life knowing exactly who you are, if you'll have me." Natalie said yes before he had even finished asking, laughing through tears that froze slightly on her cheeks in the cold. Sal Marino walked Natalie halfway down the aisle himself, joking that somebody from the plant floor ought to have a hand in giving her away since her own father no longer could. And Vera Lindholm sat in the front row dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she pretended not to need. They were married the following June at Ironwood Falls, in the same plant that had almost closed forever, surrounded by workers who had become friends and a grandfather who cried through the entire ceremony without any embarrassment at all. Natalie kept a small snow globe on her desk from then on, a gift from Earl on their wedding day, and told anyone who asked that it reminded her every single day that sometimes the coldest, most frightening moments in life turn out to be exactly the ones that lead somewhere warm. If this story touched you even a little, do not forget to subscribe to Winter Veil and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Did this remind you of anyone in your own life? Someone who showed up for you when you least expected it? Tell us in the comments below. We genuinely love reading them, and we will see you in the next story.